Okay, so today's topic is one of those things that just feels kind of uncomfortable. Not because it's confusing, but because it sounds like something that shouldn't have happened. Like it just doesn't feel like a normal part of history. And I didn't even know it was a thing until I saw the topic on the assignment brief. So the question we are looking at today is, did the FBI try to push Martin Luther King Jr. into killing himself? And I think what makes that question so difficult isn't just whether it's true or false, it's that even the confirmed parts of it are already so disturbing.
Yeah, I think that what stands out for me more is how your reaction changes the more you sit with it. At first, it just kind of sounds like it's exaggerated, things got twisted over time. You kind of don't really want to believe it, but then you actually look into the details and you realize that it's really well documented. And there's a lot of evidence to back up what's going on. And then it becomes less about is this real and more about how do we even interpret something like this?
Exactly. And I think the key thing here to keep in mind going into this is we're not just talking about a theory that came out of nowhere. There's actual historical foundation here. There's actual documents, actual investigations that took place, and confirmed actions taken by the FBI. So the conversation isn't just about proving something happened. It's about understanding what those actions meant, what they were intended for, and if they cross into something as serious as psychological manipulation with the intent to cause harm. So, if we take the claim at its simplest form, it's this. The FBI sent Martin Luther King an anonymous letter that strongly implied he should take his own life. Yeah, so we actually have a copy of the letter that we can pin up for you here. And if you guys want, you can pause the video, take a look at it, read it over, see what your opinions are. Now, whether you'd like to hear it or like that or not, it sounds very direct, but what makes it complicated is how indirect the actual message really was.
Yeah, because it wasn't just written in a way that explicitly says anything like you should do this. Instead, it kind of creates the situation where that conclusion feels like the only option being presented. And that's really a different kind of communication. It's not about telling someone what to do, it's about shaping how they see that situation.
And that's what makes it feel a lot more calculated because it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the meaning behind those and the context around those words. The FBI had already been watching him for years and they had been gathering personal information about his life, including things that could damage his reputation. So when you look at that letter, it wasn't coming out of nowhere. It was built on top of everything that we'd already known about him that was going on that the FBI had gathered.
Exactly, and that letter was basically saying, we have this information about you, it's going to become public, your reputation is going to be destroyed. And then it adds that line of like, that he has only one way out. And that phrase is really important because it's doing a lot of work without saying a lot, and it kind of leaves space for interpretation, but it also kind of guides that interpretation in a very specific direction. So before we go deeper into this, I think it's really important that we separate what we know from what we assume.
Right, so here's what's confirmed. The letter exists. It was sent anonymously. And it has been linked back to the FBI through later investigations that took place. We also know that the FBI had been conducting extensive surveillance on Martin Luther King. And this started way before the letter was even sent out.
So none of that is really debated. Where the argument starts is when we ask, what was the purpose of the letter? Was it meant to pressure him psychologically to the point of suicide, or was it meant to intimidate him and push him out of his leadership roles, which threatened them? And the problem is both of those interpretations are plausible depending on how you read the letter.
Yeah, and to understand why this even happened in the first place, you really have to kind of zoom out and look at what the United States was like at the time. And because this wasn't just about one person or one decision, it was shaped by a much larger environment. Like the 1950s and the 1960s were a period of major tension in the US, not just politically, but like socially and culturally as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there were multiple sources of tension all happening at once. You had internal conflict like the civil rights movements, and then you had external pressures like the Civil War that was taking place. And those two things didn't stay separate. They influenced how people in power reacted to each other.
So with the civil rights movement, you have this massive push for equality, and it's not just about changing laws, it's about challenging deeply rooted systems of segregation and discrimination. And Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the most visible leaders of that movement, and he was essentially heading it.
And his approach was like really specific because he emphasized nonviolence and moral responsibility and public visibility. And it just made his message harder to dismiss because it wasn't aggressive in the traditional sense.
Yeah, but at the same time, that visibility made him more threatening to certain people because he wasn't just influencing policy; he was influencing public opinion. And when public opinion starts to shift, it creates pressure on institutions.
And that's when the Cold War context becomes really important. Because during this time, there's a lot of fear about communism spreading in the United States, and that fear wasn't always based on evidence, it was often based on suspicion. So there's this idea that any movement pushing for major change could be influenced by communist ideology.
Right, so even though the civil rights movement was focused on equality and justice, it could still be viewed through that lens of suspicion. And that's where J. Edgar Hoover comes in, because he was the director of the FBI and he played a major role in shaping how the government responded to people like MLK Jr.
And Hoover did not trust Martin Luther King Jr. He believed that King might have connections to communists, and even though there wasn't strong evidence to support that, he still felt a distrust for him.
Yeah, because once that suspicion exists, it changes how someone's treated. Because now they're not just a social leader, they're seen as like a potential national security concern.
Yeah, and that's what led to all the surveillance. So the FBI began monitoring King's activities, his communications, and eventually his personal life. And this wasn't just casual observation, it was systematic.
And it was part of a larger program called COINTELPRO. And COINTELPRO wasn't just about gathering information, it was about influencing the outcomes.
Yeah, the goal wasn't neutral, it was to disrupt and weaken and discredit individuals and movements that were seen as threats to them.
Yeah, so by the time we get to the 1964, it wasn't just a new situation. The FBI had already been watching King for years. They had built a detailed understanding of his life, both his private life and his personal life.
And that context is just really important because it shows that the letter wasn't just random, like it was part of a larger pattern.
So when we look at the actual event, it helps to think of it as the result of everything we just talked about previously. So by the early 1960s, King was under constant surveillance. His phone calls were wiretapped, his hotel rooms were bugged, even his private conversations were recorded without his knowledge.
Yeah, and over time, the FBI collected information about his personal life. So some of that information included alleged affairs, which they believed could damage his credibility and reputation.
And at a certain point, they decided not to just keep that information, but to use it as well, which changes the situation completely because now it's not just about intelligence, it's about influence.
So on November 1964, King receives an anonymous package, and the timing of this is very, very significant because this happens right after he received his Nobel Peace Prize. So he's at a moment where his influence is extremely high in his career.
And inside that package, there's a tape recording and a letter, and the tape is made from the FBI surveillance, and that letter is written in a very aggressive tone.
Yeah, so the letter, it actually attacks his character, questions his integrity, and tries to dismantle his public image. But more importantly, it presents a future where all of this information can become public, and it introduces the idea that he only has one way out.
And that's where everything shifts, because now it's not just a warning, it's pressure, and it's psychological pressure, and it's the kind that's meant to affect how someone thinks and not just what they do.
So in terms of evidence, we have a few key things we're going to look at. We have the letter itself, we have confirmation that the letter came from the FBI, and we also have documented evidence of the FBI's broader efforts to discredit King and ruin his public image.
And investigations actually later did expose this pattern because, like the Church Committee, which looked into government surveillance practices, and what they found wasn't just one incident, it was a whole pattern of behavior.
But even with all of that, there's still a limit to what we can prove because there's no direct statement from the FBI stating that their goal was to cause suicide or to cause Martin Luther King to take his own life.
Yeah, and some historians argue that the intention was just intimidation, to pressure him into stepping down or just losing influence. And that distinction matters because it changes how we interpret the letter. So I think something that actually comes up when you look at all this is what effect did this actually have on him long term? Because we're talking about something that wasn't just public pressure, it was very personal and very targeted. And I think it's important to be careful here because there's no evidence that directly connects that letter to what happened later in his real life. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore the fact that this wasn't just a one-time event.
Exactly, like the letter itself is one moment, but it represents something ongoing. So it represents years of surveillance and pressure and attempts to discredit him. So even if the letter didn't directly lead to his death, it was part of a much larger environment that he was living in. And the environment matters because by the mid to late 1960s, King wasn't just dealing with opposition from the public, he was also dealing with pressure from within the government and media criticisms and from people who were actively trying to weaken his influence, essentially.
And on top of that, his role was just very incredibly demanding already. Like, he was constantly speaking and organizing and traveling, and at the same time, he was dealing with threats and criticism. So when you add something like the letter into that, it's not just one isolated moment of stress, it becomes part of a much larger psychological weight.
And I think that's where the connection becomes more indirect. It's not about saying this caused this, it's more about asking how much of all of this, the surveillance, the pressure, the attempts to discredit him, how much of this shaped the environment that he was operating in.
Yeah, because when we talk about his death, which happened in 1968, we usually focus on the immediate effect, the assassination. But we don't always look at the years leading up to it and what he was dealing with during that time period.
And that's where this becomes kind of a more broader reflection, because even if the letter didn't cause anything, it's still an example of the kind of opposition he was facing, and not just from individuals, but from institutions. Like, I think that changes how we understand the situation overall, because it shows that the challenges that he faced weren't just public disagreements; they were also happening behind the scenes and in ways that weren't visible at the time.
So I think the most accurate way to look at this is there's no direct evidence linking the letter to his death. But the letter is part of a larger pattern of pressure and surveillance that definitely shaped the conditions he was working under. And understanding that doesn't necessarily answer the question completely, but it does give a clear picture of the reality that he was facing.
So when we look at everything together, I think it's the most reasonable conclusion is that the FBI definitely engaged in psychological pressure.
And the wording of that letter just made it really difficult to ignore that implication. But proving that the exact intention was suicide is like where the uncertainty remains. So overall, this isn't a completely false conspiracy. Like, a lot of it did happen. It's based on real events and it's based on confirmed actions. But the interpretation of those actions is still heavily debated.
And honestly, even without the interpretation, what actually happened is already pretty disturbing. And this is one of those cases where history itself feels unsettling.
Because it shows how far things can go behind the scenes and we don't really know fully what's going on. So yeah, that's it.
That's it for today. Goodbye.
Like and subscribe.
Turn on notifications.
Post notifications.